Imagine this: a quiet, small town nestled along winding rivers and evergreen forests. A place where everyone knows everyone, and secrets seem impossible to keep. It's the kind of place where life moves at its own pace, where people gather at the corner cafe to swap stories over morning coffee. And in this town lived a parrot named Max, a bright green, lively bird with the sharpest eyes and a reputation as loyal as they come. Max wasn't just any parrot. He was the town's most beloved pet, and maybe, just maybe, the most observant creature in the entire area. You see, Max had a way of getting into people's hearts. Owned by Miss Eleanor, a kind and soft-spoken lady in her 70s, Max had been her faithful companion for years. Eleanor had rescued him as a young bird, and since then, Max had become her constant companion. But Max was more than just a pet to her. He was family, a curious friend with an uncanny ability to mimic voices, remember conversations, and in his own way, piece together what people said around him. In fact, people joked that Max probably knew every secret in town, and maybe, just maybe, there was a bit of truth in that. One crisp autumn morning, the town woke up to some shocking news. Something precious had gone missing from the town hall. No one could figure out how it happened, as the building had been securely locked up the night before. The police were baffled. There were no signs of forced entry, no clues left behind, and no suspects. It was as if the missing item had simply vanished into thin air. But what no one realized was that Max had noticed something strange the night before. He had perched by the window, watching through the moonlit night, his keen eyes observing movements that seemed to him unusual. And while he couldn't speak in full sentences, Max had a unique way of letting people know what he had seen. As Eleanor would soon discover, her clever parrot held the key to a mystery no one else in the town could solve. With Eleanor growing concerned, Max began repeating phrases that he hadn't said before, mimicking voices she didn't recognize. Curious and a bit unsettled, Eleanor listened closely, wondering if her feathered friend was somehow trying to tell her something important, something that might change everything. What was Max trying to say? Was it possible he had witnessed something that night? And just like that, the quiet town's mystery took a dramatic twist. Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that something was unusual about Max's behavior. Max was no stranger to picking up phrases here and there, bits of gossip, small talk from passers-by, and even a few secrets whispered when people thought they were out of earshot. But this time was different. The things Max was saying didn't sound like everyday conversation, and the urgency in his tone seemed off. He repeated a series of odd phrases that night, phrases that made little sense to Eleanor but gave her the feeling that he'd seen something important. She decided she needed to pay closer attention. As she went about her morning, Eleanor found herself thinking back to what Max had said. A single phrase echoed in her mind, one he kept repeating almost as if he were trying to emphasize its importance, not supposed to be here. The way he said it was eerie, almost cautious, as though he'd picked up on a hushed conversation in the dead of night. Max had never sounded like this before. With each repeat of the phrase, Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. Who or what wasn't supposed to be here? The mystery of the missing item from Town Hall continued to ripple through the small community, becoming the main topic of conversation. People wondered how something could go missing from such a secure place. To Eleanor, it seemed impossible that no one else in town had noticed anything strange that night. She couldn't have been the only one who heard those strange sounds echoing through the streets. Nor could Max have been the only one watching. Over the next few days, Max's odd behavior continued. He started repeating even more puzzling phrases in voices that sounded like the people from town, yet distorted somehow, like they were trying to be hidden. Sometimes it was a deep whisper that she could barely make out, or a hurried tone that sounded nervous. Eleanor's unease only grew. She felt as if Max was holding on to something that could make sense of everything, but she couldn't quite reach it. One evening, Eleanor invited a few close friends over. They were mostly people who had known her for years, and everyone in their small circle was familiar with Max's uncanny ability to mimic voices and sounds. They sat around her cozy living room, sipping tea and trading theories about the theft and the strangeness surrounding it. Every so often, one of them would look over at Max, who sat quietly on his perch, observing them with a curious, calculating gaze. It was as if he knew they were talking about him. As they chatted, Max began muttering again, repeating snippets of conversation he had picked up. This time, it sounded like fragments of different voices, pieced together like parts of a puzzle. Eleanor and her friends exchanged uneasy glances. It felt like Max was replaying pieces of a hidden conversation that had been lost in the shadows of the night. And one phrase stood out. A faint voice, almost too soft to hear, saying, "Meet me tonight." Eleanor shivered, feeling an inexplicable chill run down her spine. Who had Max overheard, and where had this mysterious meeting taken place? What had he seen in the quiet hours of the night when no one else was awake? The townsfolk continued to grow uneasy as more strange incidents occurred. A few people swore they'd seen shadowy figures lingering around the town hall late at night, but no one could say for sure who they were. It was becoming clear that the mystery went deeper than anyone had initially thought. Eleanor started to wonder if Max's repeated phrases could be the pieces needed to uncover the truth. She began keeping a small notebook, jotting down every phrase Max repeated, hoping they might eventually form a coherent picture. In her quiet moments, she sat by Max's side, talking to him softly, coaxing him to say more. She felt a connection between the two of them, like Max understood her more deeply than anyone else could. And in return, Max seemed to want to help her solve the mystery, as if he knew he held the key to something bigger than either of them could imagine. One night, as she was drifting off to sleep, Eleanor heard a faint sound from Max's cage. She strained to listen, her ears catching his familiar voice muttering in the darkness. This time it was different. The voice he imitated was low, stern, and almost chilling. The words sent a shiver through her, lingering in the silence. "It's safe. No one will know." Eleanor sat up, her heart pounding. She could hardly believe what she'd heard. Max had repeated the words with such conviction that it was as if he were replaying the exact moment when the plan had been made. The mystery was growing clearer, but it was also becoming more frightening. Eleanor knew she had to tread carefully. She was no detective, and she didn't want to jump to conclusions. But every part of her sensed that Max's words were clues, breadcrumbs leading to an answer that lay just out of reach. Determined to get to the bottom of things, Eleanor started doing some gentle sleuthing around town. She asked a few questions here and there, trying not to raise any suspicions. But the more she asked, the clearer it became that people were hiding something. Friends who had always been open with her suddenly seemed cautious, quick to change the subject. It was as though an invisible wall had been built around the truth, and Eleanor was determined to find a way through it. The strange thing was, Max seemed to sense her determination. Every time she returned home after one of her quiet investigations, Max would greet her with new phrases, each one laced with hints she could barely understand. It was as if he were guiding her, pushing her forward on this strange journey. And yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were both walking into something far more complicated than she had anticipated. Late one evening, Eleanor found herself standing by Max's cage, watching him as he slept. She knew that whatever he had seen that night, it was imprinted deep in his memory. Max had a gift, one that was rare and invaluable. He was a quiet observer, a silent guardian who held secrets no one else could uncover. And as she stood there, a question lingered in her mind. What would happen when they finally unlocked the truth? The next morning, Eleanor woke up to find Max unusually quiet. His bright eyes had a faraway look, as if he were lost in thought. She watched him closely, feeling a surge of gratitude for this loyal friend who had somehow become entangled in a mystery that was growing darker by the day. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain. Max held the key to the answers she sought. And together, they would find a way to uncover the truth hidden in the shadows. Days turned into a quiet, uneasy rhythm for Eleanor. She felt like she was living in two worlds, one where she went about her everyday life, and another that seemed to pull her further into this mystery that only she and Max could understand. But the closer she got to finding answers, the more the world around her seemed to shift. The town that had always felt safe now seemed shadowed with suspicion, as if something dark lurked just beneath the surface. And Max, he had changed too. He was alert, watching the door and window as if expecting something or someone. One evening, Eleanor sat by the window, the soft glow of her lamp casting a warm circle of light around her. Max was perched beside her, quiet, his sharp eyes tracking every sound outside. The wind was picking up, rattling branches against the house, and every so often Eleanor caught Max glancing at the door, his feathers fluffed with attention she hadn't seen before. She took a deep breath, placing her hand gently on his perch as if to reassure him. But the truth was, she felt the same nervous energy, as though they were both waiting for something to happen. The next day, Eleanor received an unexpected visit from Mr. Hartley, the town's head of security. He was known for his strict, no-nonsense demeanor and rarely visited anyone unless it was official business. Eleanor opened the door, surprised to see him standing there, his face set with an unreadable expression. He stepped inside, his eyes flickering toward Max, who was watching from his perch, uncharacteristically quiet. "Eleanor, I wanted to ask you a few questions," Mr. Hartley said, his voice low. "I understand that you've been asking around about the missing item from Town Hall." She nodded slowly, suddenly wary. "Yes, I have. But only because, well, Max has been acting strangely ever since that night. I believe he saw something, or heard something. He keeps repeating odd phrases that don't make any sense. I thought maybe he had some clue to what happened." Mr. Hartley's eyes narrowed as he glanced at Max, and for a brief moment, Eleanor thought she saw a flash of fear in his gaze. "Parrots can be unpredictable with what they pick up," he said carefully, as though choosing his words with caution. "It's best not to make assumptions. Sometimes what they repeat is just noise." But Eleanor could tell he wasn't here to just dismiss her suspicions. He seemed tense, shifting on his feet, glancing at Max with a look she couldn't quite place. It was almost as if he was wary of the bird, as though he knew Max had overheard something important. Just as Mr. Hartley turned to leave, Max squawked out a phrase Eleanor hadn't heard before. His voice dropped to a near whisper, and the words sounded almost like a warning. "They'll come back. Be ready." Mr. Hartley froze in the doorway, his face paling slightly. He looked back at Max, his hand gripping the doorknob. "Eleanor, if I were you, I'd keep a close eye on that bird. Parrots, they don't always understand what they're repeating. And sometimes, repeating the wrong thing can get people into trouble." With that, he left, closing the door behind him, leaving Eleanor alone with Max in the eerie quiet of her home. She could feel her heart pounding, the words hanging in the air like a threat. Be ready. Be ready for what? Eleanor wondered, her mind racing with possibilities. Why had Mr. Hartley seemed so nervous? And why had he looked at Max like that, as though Max had uncovered a truth no one wanted revealed? As the night settled in, Eleanor found herself feeling more on edge than ever. Every creak of the house seemed louder, every shadow longer. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something that would change everything. She stayed close to Max, speaking to him softly, hoping he'd reveal more of the mystery. And then, in the quiet hours of the night, Max began to talk again. But this time, his voice took on a frantic edge, repeating phrases that made Eleanor's skin prickle. "Not supposed to be here. Tonight, they'll come." He said it over and over, his eyes wide, feathers ruffled as if he could sense an invisible presence creeping closer. Eleanor's heart raced as she listened, her mind piecing together the clues, her pulse quickening as she realized what Max was trying to tell her. Suddenly, she heard a noise outside, a faint rustling, like footsteps brushing through fallen leaves. She held her breath, straining to listen, feeling a chill settle over her. She glanced at Max, who was staring at the window, his feathers pressed flat, his tiny eyes fixed on the darkness beyond. Eleanor slowly moved toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. In the dim light, she could see shadows moving across her yard, figures slipping quietly through the darkness toward her house. Her breath caught as she recognized Mr. Hartley's outline among them. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning her windows as if searching for signs of life inside. Her mind raced, fear coursing through her veins as she watched him and the others creeping closer, their footsteps silent, their faces hidden in the shadows. Max let out a low, urgent whistle, snapping Eleanor back to the moment. She realized that they had to do something, that somehow the two of them had been drawn into a mystery deeper and darker than she had ever imagined. She could feel Max's tension, his keen senses alert to the danger surrounding them, and she knew he understood the risk as much as she did. He was her lookout, her ally in this strange battle for truth, and she trusted him completely. Just then, the figures outside stopped, their heads tilting toward the house as though they could sense her watching. She froze, heart pounding as Mr. Hartley raised his hand, signaling the others. She knew they were planning something, and the knowledge sent a fresh wave of fear through her. But she couldn't back down now. She was too close to the truth. Inside, Max began whispering once more, repeating the words that had started it all, "Not supposed to be here." The words echoed in her mind, mingling with the tension building in the air, the sense of imminent danger that seemed to fill every corner of her home. Eleanor took a deep breath, gathering her courage, knowing that whatever happened next would decide everything. As the shadows drew closer, Eleanor felt a strange calm settle over her. She knew she had to protect Max, to keep him safe from whatever forces were working to bury the truth. She glanced at her loyal companion, his eyes meeting hers, and in that silent exchange, she knew they were in this together. Whatever they were about to face, they would face it side by side, ready to confront the secrets hiding in the darkness. Eleanor gripped the edge of her chair, barely breathing as the shadows outside crept closer, wrapping her home in an eerie silence. She could sense something was about to break, a final piece of the puzzle just waiting to fall into place. Max sat motionless, his eyes fixed on her with an intensity she'd never seen before, as if he knew this night held the answer they'd been searching for. Suddenly, Max let out a sharp, piercing squawk, echoing through the stillness and shattering the silence. The figures outside froze, startled by the noise. In that split second, Eleanor had an idea, a bold, desperate plan that she hoped would force the truth to reveal itself. She knew Max's memory was sharp, and that he could mimic voices almost perfectly, often capturing every detail down to the tone and inflection. And if she was right, she could use this to her advantage. Eleanor leaned close to Max, her voice barely above a whisper. "Max," she murmured, "I need you to do something for me. Remember everything you've heard?" "Repeat it, all of it." She wasn't sure if he would understand, but Max seemed to sense her urgency. He tilted his head, his eyes bright with understanding, and began repeating every word he'd memorized from that fateful night, piecing together fragments of conversations, each one a key to the truth they were so close to uncovering. Max's voice filled the room, low and hushed, like a distant memory echoing through the walls. Eleanor listened closely as he repeated words she hadn't heard before, words that painted a clearer picture of that night. In his sharp, eerie voice, Max mimicked Mr. Hartley's voice, saying, "Meet me after midnight. It has to be quiet. No one can know." Each phrase felt like a spark, illuminating the hidden pieces of the mystery she hadn't yet grasped. Just then, a voice outside broke the tension. "She has to know something," one of the figures whispered, sounding anxious, unsure. Eleanor's heart raced as she realized they were aware of her suspicions, that they'd come to silence whatever she and Max had uncovered. But then came another surprise, a second voice, one she recognized all too well, Mr. Hartley's. "We've got to end this," he said, his tone resolute and dark. "That bird knows too much. Eleanor's too close." Eleanor's mind raced as she absorbed the weight of what she'd just heard. She'd been right all along. Max had overheard everything that night. But it wasn't just a simple theft they were covering up. It was something deeper, something far more dangerous. The missing item was only part of the story. Eleanor had unknowingly stumbled onto a web of secrets that stretched beyond anything she could have imagined, secrets that certain people would go to any length to protect. As Eleanor watched the shadows shift outside, her fear turned into a fierce resolve. She had to find a way to expose them, to reveal the truth for everyone to see. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling as she began recording Max, capturing every word he repeated, every incriminating phrase he'd memorized. She knew that once this was out, there'd be no turning back. But just as she hit record, Max stopped speaking, his feathers ruffled, his eyes darting nervously toward the door. A new sound filled the room, a low, ominous creak as the front door slowly opened. Eleanor's heart pounded as she turned toward it, her mind racing with thoughts of escape. She and Max were out of time. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Hartley, his face cast in shadows, his eyes dark and unreadable. He took a slow step inside, his gaze sweeping over the room, landing on Max. Eleanor instinctively moved between them, her hands shaking as she held her phone tightly. "Eleanor," Mr. Hartley began, his voice calm but laced with something colder. I think it's time we had a talk. I didn't want things to come to this, but you've left me no choice." Max let out a nervous chirp. His feathers puffed, and Eleanor felt a surge of protectiveness. She met Mr. Hartley's gaze, refusing to back down. "You're here to silence us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with defiance. "Max knows everything, and so do I." Mr. Hartley took another step forward, his expression hardening. "I was hoping you'd let this go. But you and that bird of yours had to keep digging where you didn't belong. If you knew what was at stake, you'd understand why some things need to stay buried." In that tense moment, Eleanor's resolve only grew stronger. She had something Mr. Hartley hadn't expected, a record of every word, every confession Max had unwittingly captured. And now, armed with the truth, she knew she had the power to bring everything to light. As she backed away, holding her phone close, Mr. Hartley's eyes narrowed, realizing she had something he hadn't accounted for. But before he could react, Max let out one final chilling phrase, a phrase that seemed to echo through the silence like a warning: the truth always comes out. Eleanor and Mr. Hartley stared at each other, caught in a standoff that felt like the calm before the storm. She knew the stakes had never been higher, that she was standing on the edge of a dangerous truth. And as the night deepened, she felt a sense of clarity, a realization that there was no turning back. This was it. The moment she and Max had been building toward, the moment they would expose everything hidden in the shadows. Eleanor's heart pounded as she faced Mr. Hartley, her fingers clenched around her phone. She could feel Max's small, steady presence at her side, his eyes locked on the man who had somehow transformed from trusted neighbor to a figure shrouded in secrets. She knew now that she and Max had uncovered something that couldn't be hidden any longer, no matter what Mr. Hartley or anyone else in town wanted. Mr. Hartley took a step forward, his gaze darkening as he raised a hand, reaching for her phone. "Hand it over, Eleanor," he said, his voice steely. "We can make this all go away if you just let it go." But Eleanor didn't move. Every instinct in her told her to hold her ground, that if she surrendered now, she and Max would be silenced, their voices lost in a town that had learned to turn a blind eye. She felt a flash of anger rise up in her, a determination not just for herself, but for Max, who had uncovered these hidden truths in his own quiet way, trusting her to protect them. Just as Mr. Hartley reached for her phone, Max squawked, loud and insistent, breaking the tension like a bolt of lightning. He launched himself from his perch, flying straight at Mr. Hartley's outstretched hand, nipping at his fingers and causing him to recoil in surprise. Eleanor seized the moment, pulling back and gripping her phone tightly as she hit send, uploading the recording to multiple contacts in her phone, ensuring that it would be out in the world before anyone could stop her. Mr. Hartley's expression changed from frustration to something darker, a flicker of realization dawning in his eyes. "What have you done?" he demanded, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Eleanor looked him squarely in the eye, her voice steady. "I made sure the truth won't stay hidden. People will hear what Max uncovered. They'll know everything." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, Mr. Hartley simply stared at her, his face etched with disbelief. And then, as if from somewhere deep in his own buried conscience, he let out a low, defeated sigh. His shoulders slumped, and the stern, unyielding expression he'd worn for so long seemed to crumble. "Fine," he muttered, a strange calm settling over him. "You want the truth? It's out now. Maybe it was only a matter of time." Mr. Hartley slumped into a nearby chair, looking suddenly weary, as if he'd been carrying a weight too heavy to bear. He spoke slowly, explaining how the missing item, a set of old town records, was no ordinary theft. Buried within those documents were secrets from decades past, secrets that involved people he'd sworn to protect. Some of the town's oldest families had ties to events long hidden away, and Mr. Hartley had felt a twisted loyalty to preserve that secrecy, even if it meant silencing the only witnesses. But just as the truth came spilling out, a final twist unfolded that left Eleanor speechless. Max let out a series of low whistles, repeating words he'd never spoken before, words that sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. "It's not just him. More coming." Mr. Hartley's face paled as he looked out the window, his eyes widening in alarm. There, at the edge of Eleanor's yard, figures were approaching. Other townspeople, people who, like Mr. Hartley, had played roles in the long-hidden story Max had uncovered. As they drew closer, Eleanor realized that the recording she'd sent had reached the ears of everyone who needed to hear it. The townsfolk who had hidden their own secrets for years were coming forward, summoned by the very truth she had revealed. Mr. Hartley watched, his face a mixture of fear and resignation, as the people filed into the yard. Each person looked from him to Eleanor, and then, almost reverently, at Max, as though understanding that this little parrot, with his uncanny memory, had brought long-buried secrets to light. Eleanor's heart swelled with a quiet triumph. She and Max had not only uncovered the mystery, but had inspired the town to finally confront its own hidden past. And then, as the silence stretched, Eleanor realized one more truth. The town's legacy had been built on secrets and shadows, but it would be rebuilt on honesty and courage. Max, with his keen eye and loyal heart, had been the one to pull those shadows into the light, reminding everyone that sometimes the smallest voices speak the loudest. In that moment, Max let out a final, satisfied squawk, a note of triumph filling the air as the truth settled over them all. The days that followed felt like a blur to Eleanor. The truth Max had uncovered sent shockwaves through the town, unraveling layers of secrets that had been carefully buried for decades. Everyone knew now about the records, the lies, and the people who had been involved. The townsfolk, some of whom had long harbored their own suspicions, began to understand the depth of the story Max had exposed, and the little parrot became an unexpected hero, a symbol of truth in the most unlikely of forms. Eleanor could hardly go anywhere without someone stopping her to ask about Max, his memory, or the strange courage that had helped them confront a mystery no one else dared to. She felt proud, not only of herself for standing up when it mattered, but of Max, whose loyalty and intelligence had guided her through the darkest moments. In his own quiet way, Max had given a voice to the truth, and she couldn't imagine how different her life would have been without him by her side. One afternoon, Eleanor found herself back at her favorite spot by the window. Max perched beside her, calmly preening his feathers. He seemed content, as if he understood that his role in the mystery was complete, and that the peace settling over the town was a testament to his quiet bravery. As they sat together, Eleanor reflected on all that had happened, the tension, the danger, and the courage it had taken to face it all. In that moment, she felt something unexpected, a deep gratitude for the journey, despite its hardships. In the weeks that followed, the town slowly began to heal. With the truth now public, people felt a weight lifted from their lives, a release from the shadows that had lingered for far too long. The revelations led to conversations that had never been possible before. Some families found closure, some friendships were mended, and people began to trust each other in ways they hadn't dared to for years. It was as if Max's discovery had sparked a collective courage, a willingness to face the past together and move forward. One day, as Eleanor and Max strolled through the town square, they saw a small group of children gathering around a statue near the town hall. A statue that had been recently dedicated to Max, the town's loyal parrot who had unearthed a mystery. The plaque read, "Max, the voice of truth." Eleanor smiled as she watched the children lean in, eager to hear stories of the brave parrot. She could almost hear Max puffing up proudly beside her, thrilled to be at the center of it all. Life returned to a gentle rhythm for Eleanor and Max. She resumed her quiet days in the garden, chatting with neighbors who now looked at her with newfound respect and gratitude. Max continued his habit of perching on her shoulder, watching the world with those keen eyes of his, as if waiting for another mystery to unfold. But things felt different now. There was a calm in the air, a sense of safety that hadn't been there before. As evening settled one day, Eleanor sat with Max, reflecting on all that they'd been through together. She realized that Max had given her more than just companionship. He'd shown her the power of loyalty, courage, and the importance of standing up for what's right. Max, with his small stature and gentle heart, had taught her that sometimes the most unassuming voices carry the greatest truths. It was a lesson she would carry with her always. With a soft chirp, Max snuggled into Eleanor's shoulder, his feathers warm against her cheek. She reached up to stroke him, her heart full of gratitude. Together, they'd changed something bigger than themselves, and in doing so, they had become an inseparable team. Two voices that had stood together against the odds.